On the darkest night the Missouri frontier ever swallowed, a silent ripple on the river warned Abram Holt that he was no longer alone. Fog rolled in so thick it erased the world, leaving only the pulse of danger drifting toward his homestead. But Abram didn't reach for a rifle. He reached for ash, light, and the physics of the night itself. Before dawn, 3 thieves would discover just how deadly a prepared homesteader could be, and the river would reveal which man truly understood the dark. The fog pressed close to the Missouri tributary like a living weight, its dampness clinging to bark, wool, and breath. Humidity hovered near 90%, pulling the night air into a heavy, smothering blanket that blurred edges and softened every contour of the land. The river itself held at roughly 52 degrees Fahrenheit, a cold sheet of moving steel hidden beneath a white lid of vapor. Even the cottonwoods along the bank seemed muted silhouettes, their crowns lost in the drifting haze. Abram Holt, age 41, stood inside his single-room log cabin and sensed the night tighten. He was a Civil War veteran who carried the quiet stiffness of men who had survived too much. The war had carved a rigidity into his shoulders and left a faint tremor in his right hand. But frontier life had given him purpose again. He had cleared his homestead himself, dropping timber with a 24-inch felling axe and shaping each log notch with deliberate precision. The cabin measured 16 by 18 feet, its cedar roof pitched to shed the punishing rains that often swept this valley. A clearing of about 40 yards stretched from his front porch to the path that led toward the riverbank, 70 yards away. This land was his refuge, but nights like this reminded him that refuge was never guaranteed. Modern thinking imagines a home as a boundary of safety, but on the 1870s frontier, the walls were only symbolic. Real security depended on awareness, readiness, and the instinct to read nature when people hid behind it. Tonight, that instinct whispered that something was wrong. The first sign arrived not by sight, but by a subtle fracture in the river's voice. Abram had lived beside this tributary long enough to understand its patterns. He knew the drag of current against fallen limbs, the clatter of loose gravel tumbling in shallows, the soft, constant pulse of water folding over itself. But now something foreign intruded, a faint, muffled dip, rhythmic and deliberate. Oars. Slow ones. Someone was keeping the stroke shallow enough to avoid slapping the surface. River thieves often time their movements for fog-choked nights. It masked their location, softened their approach, and made it nearly impossible to see a skiff until it was almost too close to stop. They typically cut across the current at an angle, letting the movement of the river disguise their own movement. They struck isolated homes where livestock, cured meat, or dried beans could be taken quickly. Tonight's conditions were exactly what such men waited for. Low visibility under 25 feet, no moon, and the natural silence that came when animals bedded down early. Abram felt the hush fall. Even his dogs, 2 sharp-eared mixed hounds, were absent tonight. They had slipped into the timber earlier, stirred by a scent he had dismissed as deer or fox. But now their absence carved a hollow feeling through him. Dogs avoid more than predators. Sometimes they avoid men. He moved slowly, keeping each step measured on the cabin floorboards. He lifted his lantern from its hook and adjusted the wick until the flame thinned to a controlled beam. Too much light would make him a target. Too little would leave him blind. The tremor in his right hand returned, but not from fear. It was the old wound from Atlanta, a reminder of a musket ball that had torn through muscle but spared bone. That tremor had saved him once, forced him to shoot slower, more deliberately. Tonight he hoped deliberate thinking would again be his ally. He crossed to the window, the interior dimly lit by the lantern's narrow glow. The tree line was a smear of shadow. The clearing, a swallowed field of white. Fog pooled and coiled, slipping between the stumps like smoke without a fire. He listened again. The oars were closer and better timed now. Whoever was out there knew how to move without drawing attention. That skill alone was troubling. He scanned for movement. Nothing. But the river's breathing, soft, consistent, shifted once more. The gullies that fed the tributary carried sound strangely, bending it, stretching it. Abram had learned over the past 3 winters that even a single paddle against the current could echo in deceptive ways. But tonight's sound was steady and approaching. Not driftwood. Not animal. Men. He set the lantern down on the porch rail and let his eyes adjust. The fog thickened in response, swirling as if trying to deny him even the faintest shapes. He reached for the bucket of wet ash sitting beside the door. It was a homestead habit, ash for sealing odors, for marking tracks, for dousing sparks. Tonight, it offered something more useful. Concealment. A handful tossed at the right moment could create a cloud dense enough to break visibility for a few seconds. On nights like this, seconds were leverage. He stepped out onto the porch, boots sinking slightly into damp boards. The cold air slipped through his shirt collar and climbed along his spine. Every instinct warned him that the river carried unwelcome company. Still, he forced himself to stand steady. Frontier life demanded a balance between courage and caution. Panic had no place here. The fog pressed tighter, almost as if reacting to his presence. He squinted toward the riverbank, breathing slow and controlled. His pulse steadied. He felt the ash bucket's rough rim against his fingers, grounding him in the moment. The river murmured, low, steady, and then interrupted. A shape emerged where no shape should be, barely a distortion in the rolling fog, but distinct enough to break the rhythm of the night. A skiff. Long, narrow, moving without sound, gliding toward the bank with the intention of men who knew darkness like a craft. The outline thickened, drifting as though pushed by unseen hands. And as Abram narrowed his gaze, he realized the vessel was not drifting at all. It was steering, straight toward his clearing. Through the fog, he spotted the faint outline of a drifting skiff, moving without sound. Frontier nights tested more than strength. They tested resolve. Abram Holt had survived war and wilderness, and he carried lessons carved by both. But tonight, the river offered a new test, whether he could defend his home alone without firing a single shot to give away his position. Darkness was never neutral on the frontier. It either protected a family or betrayed them. Abram's mind worked quickly, shaped by years spent as a Union signal scout during the war. Those years had taught him that sound, light, and terrain spoke their own languages, and any man who ignored those languages risked his life. Abram had guided regiments across flooded hollows, calculated lantern positions for silent communication, and mapped retreat routes by the way tree lines bent in moonlight. Many scouts survived on instinct, but Abram survived on understanding. He thought briefly of a newcomer who had settled a few miles upriver just 2 months ago. The man had arrived with grand hopes, claiming the frontier would be simple because the land was open and unclaimed. He had built his storehouse too close to the waterline, leaving it exposed to anyone drifting by. Thieves noticed such mistakes long before neighbors did. One fog-heavy night, identical to this one, they took everything the newcomer owned: beans, flour, tools, even the last crate of salt pork he had planned to stretch through winter. The man had wept the next morning, insisting that he never heard a sound. Abram remembered telling him gently that silence on the river was never a comfort. It was a warning. Now Abram stood on his own porch, remembering that conversation as the skiff continued sliding toward shore. He had always believed that running from danger at night was a last resort. Men who ran often ran into terrain traps, fallen logs, slick clay, blind hollows, while those who stayed and managed their environment sometimes bought themselves the time needed to think, regroup, and protect their families. Tonight, running was not an option at all. His wife and 2 children slept in a small lean-to just 20 feet behind the cabin, sheltered under cedar shingles and wrapped in quilts. They had no idea trouble drifted toward them. Abram's doctrine for night defense was simple and firm. Never depend solely on firearms once the sun set. Darkness distorted aim, magnified recoil, and revealed muzzle flash like a beacon. In those conditions, light and misdirection carried more weight than bullets. He had seen Plains tribes use similar tactics during his travels, men who mastered night movement by controlling embers, shielding torchlight, and using smoke to manipulate visibility. Their methods taught him that light was as much a tool as any rifle. He owned a rifle, a single-shot, 10-pound piece with a walnut stock, and a barrel he had cleaned so often the metal gleamed even in poor light. It was reliable, but not fast. The reload time sat around 18 seconds, if done under calm conditions. Against a single intruder, that might suffice. Against multiple attackers on a fog-bound night, it was inadequate. A fired shot would also reveal his exact location and draw attention immediately to the lean-to where his family slept. He could all noises that seemed larger, shifting an enemy's perception of distance and direction. He lowered the lantern flame again, thinning it to a faint line of gold barely visible through the fog. The light trembled, but held.
He moved a half-step backward into shadow, keeping his boots silent on the porch floor. The fog thickened as if responding to his caution, rolling in tight coils between the cabin and the riverbank. It disguised his movements, but also disguised theirs. He listened. At first, there was only the soft pulse of the river and the thick hush of night. Then, beneath both, he caught it. A faint shuffle. A whisper of weight shifting in a wooden skiff, then another. The sound was brief, but clear enough to reveal the truth. More than one man. 3, if his experience with river acoustics held true. Men who worked in groups often carried different weight distributions. The skiff's subtle rocking matched patterns he had learned years ago while identifying enemy scouts on cramped riverboats. The realization tightened his focus. 3 men meant coordinated intent. They would expect fear, maybe even a scramble to escape. They did not understand the man waiting for them. Abram Holt had not survived war, drought, and 2 harsh winters on instinct alone. He survived because he refused to yield ground without calculation. He glanced toward the lean-to where his family slept. The cedar shakes gleamed faintly with moisture, and he could picture his wife resting with their youngest curled at their side. He imagined waking them in panic and knew it would only increase the danger. They needed to remain unaware for now, shielded by ignorance until he created an advantage large enough to protect them. The skiff drifted closer. Its outline pulsed faintly in the fog, visible only when the lantern's low flame flickered along the right angle. Abram tightened his grip on the ash bucket. His breath slowed again. Each inhalation came steady and controlled, matching the rhythm he had used on long reconnaissance marches years before. He crouched slightly, letting the darkness fold over him. The river lapped softly, pushing thin sheets of water against the bank. The fog swirled and lifted for a heartbeat, revealing the skiff's prow. Abram saw the faintest shadow of a hand gripping the edge. Another hand followed, steadying the vessel as it approached the shallow mud at the bank. No voices yet. Silence meant focus, and focus meant preparation. He shifted his weight again, aligning himself with the cabin's support post. It offered partial cover, though he hoped he would not need it. His goal remained unchanged. Protect without firing. Control the scene. Force hesitation. Create doubt. Then the night changed. A low whisper drifted across the clearing. Soft, hushed, and unmistakable. Not one voice. Not 2. 3. Inside the fog, he heard whispered movement. 3 men, not 1.
He touched the edge of the first track with 2 fingers. The mud was cool, but not cold. Moisture had already begun reabsorbing into the heel impression, a subtle softening that told him the tracks were no more than 40 minutes old. The thieves had reached land before the skiff even entered view. Abram had expected trouble from the water, but this changed everything. If these men had come ashore early, then the skiff's slow approach served a purpose, either as distraction or blockade. Thieves rarely committed to a single entry path. They relied on confusion, forcing their target to divide attention between multiple threats. Tonight, they were executing a layered approach designed to corner him. Abram leaned close without bending over the prince, remembering the critical rule he'd learned years ago from an older trapper: never stand directly over tracks at night. A silhouette cast across the ground would be visible to anyone watching from the tree line, revealing not only his presence, but also his focus. He kept his shoulders low, posture angled, movements compact. The fog around him pulsed with shifting density, occasionally thinning enough to reveal flashes of water glinting under the lantern's soft arc. In moments like this, every tiny detail mattered. Where the mud cracked, how the cattails bent, whether the shorebirds stirred. Tonight, they remained silent, which meant the men who made these prints had traveled with deliberate quiet. He measured stride spacing next. The steps sat about 23 inches apart, neither rushed nor casual. That told him the thieves were moving with purpose, not panic. No one was fleeing, and no one was scouting blindly. They were advancing. Abram followed the subtle line of impressions as they curved toward the rear tree line that framed the cabin's clearing. That route was dangerous in its own right. The trees thickened behind the cabin, but opened into a narrow funnel near the lean-to where his family slept.
Anyone approaching from that angle could position themselves within 15 yards of his children without ever being seen. Whoever planned this knew the land well enough to exploit that vulnerability. He forced himself to think clearly, grounding his thoughts in survival method rather than emotion. Nighttime track reading demanded discipline. Step 1. Use the lantern at a low angle to create shadow relief and avoid overexposing the prints. Step 2. Estimate the track age by touching the surface lightly, gauging both temperature and moisture reabsorption. Step 3. Measure stride spacing to determine speed and intention. Step 4. Study the print depth for clues about weight distribution. Step 5. Always keep in mind, never reveal your outline over the evidence. The frontier rewarded precision and punished haste. These steps, simple as they seemed, had saved more than a few scouts who learned to treat the night as an instructor rather than a threat. Abram rose slowly, listening for anything the fog carried. Somewhere deeper in the haze, the river gave a quiet slap against a drifted log, followed by faint ripples that did not match the rhythm of natural movement. He recognized the sound instantly. Someone was waiting, slowly, carefully, and trying not to disturb the surface. The thieves were not only dividing their approach, they were testing the shoreline to find the safest entry. If one man was already on land and another advancing through water, then the third, likely still in the skiff, was watching the clearing for any sign of reaction.
Storyteller and narrator. Rivers offer escape routes, but on this night, the current turned into a trap, one Abram could use against the men hunting him. With thieves on his land, he would need the river's physics, not just its darkness, to regain control. Every ripple became a tool, every reflection a possible mask, and every sound a chance to move without giving away his position. The current slid past the muddy bank with a steady southward pull, pushing broken cattails downstream as if guiding them along a predetermined path. Waterlogged branches drifted quietly, bumping against each other with soft, hollow taps that blended into the night. The fog dampened most noises, but amplified the subtle ones, drawing Abram's attention to the ways the river behaved under low visibility. The flow held at roughly 2 to 3 miles per hour, enough to shift debris without creating telltale splashes. He watched pieces of reeds spin slowly as they floated, their movements irregular and unpredictable. Those natural distortions gave Abram an idea. If he manipulated light over moving water, the thieves' perception of distance and direction could shift in ways they wouldn't notice until too late. He crouched low near the bank, maintaining control of his lantern's narrow beam. The flame reflected off the rippling surface in warped bands that refused to follow straight lines. This distortion was precisely what he needed. The human eye instinctively tries to interpret reflections as fixed or symmetrical, but in conditions like these, water turned them into floating phantoms. Abram realized he could use that instability to suggest motion where none existed. The thieves might assume he was standing, pacing, or approaching from certain angles, based solely on the light's shifting pattern across the river. He angled the lantern downward, letting the glow skim the water at a shallow tilt. The reflections stretched and blurred, creating the illusion of a figure moving near the bank. The more the current tugged at the water's surface, the more the lantern's projection danced, appearing to change shape with each subtle ripple. Abram stayed behind a clump of cattails, shielded from direct view, allowing the river to host the illusion instead of his cabin wall or porch railing. It was the kind of deception that worked only in certain conditions: slow current, dense fog, minimal wind, and tonight, all three aligned.
Storyteller and narrator. He timed his own movements with the current's rhythm. When the water slapped gently against a drifting log, he shifted one step. When a strand of cattails snapped softly under its own weight, he used that moment to move another few feet along the bank. Patience mattered more than speed. The thieves were listening for abrupt sound changes, not for quiet repositioning blended into natural noise. The river's subtle lapping masked the delicate crunch of damp grass beneath his boots, transforming each step into a barely distinguishable echo. Abram reminded himself to avoid the wet clay patches he knew lined the lower bank. Though they offered silent footing, they were dangerously slick and could send him sliding into view. Safety demanded balance. Silent movement meant nothing if he lost his footing in the fog. He stayed on the firmer soil just above the clay strip, distributing weight carefully with each step. The lantern remained angled low, casting distorted silhouettes that drifted across the water like wandering ghosts. The thieves reacted almost immediately. Abram heard a quiet whisper from the tree line, followed by the faint shift of gravel as two men changed direction. They were tracking the false movement, drawn toward where they assumed the homesteader paced openly near the bank. Another sound emerged next, soft, deliberate, and concerning. One thief had not followed the others. Instead, he turned toward the back of the clearing, moving with a careful rhythm that indicated purpose, not curiosity. Abram understood the pattern. The thieves were employing a sweep, two advancing toward the cabin to test defenses, one circling to exploit any family shelter hidden behind the main structure. The thought sent a cold thrum through Abram's chest. His wife and children slept in the lean-to, 20 feet behind the cabin, unaware of the danger. The structure was small, built from cedar planks and shielded partially by young spruce saplings. It was meant to be separate from the cabin for summer ventilation, not for a night like this. If one thief reached it undetected, the entire situation could change instantly. Abram listened harder, allowing the river's natural cadence to frame each new sound. The thieves' footsteps were faint but decipherable. Two were clearly moving between 30 and 40 yards away, using the confusion of the lantern's reflection to approach cautiously. But the third thief's progress was different, slow, deliberate, almost measured. The boot suction he had heard earlier came again, but this time from behind the cabin, not from the bank. That meant the circling man had found the dry path leading toward the shelter. Abram adjusted his position. He slid the lantern a few inches forward, letting the reflection widen across the water. The shifting glow encouraged the two front attackers to stay focused on the river, but now he needed to reposition himself silently to the rear of the cabin. He waited for a natural swell in the current. When the river bumped a large branch into a cluster of reeds, creating a soft, hollow thump, he moved swiftly along the grass where the fog lay thickest. His steps fell in the same rhythm as the river's noises. The technique allowed him to glide across the clearing without breaking the soundscape. Halfway to the cabin, he paused and crouched. The fog pressed low, swirling around his boots. He could feel how the night tightened, how every sense honed itself to a razor's edge. Somewhere downstream, a faint splash echoed, signaling that the thieves repositioned their skiff or adjusted their formation. The sound was not loud, but it carried meaning. They were preparing to close in. Abram reached the backside of the cabin, heart steady, mind calculating. The river had done its part, masking his movements and misleading the thieves. But now he needed information. Where exactly was the circling man? He lowered the lantern just enough to cast a sliver of light over the ground behind the cabin, careful not to reveal himself. The mud told the story instantly. Fresh tracks, pressed sharply into the soil, led directly toward the lean-to. The footprints were crisp, spaced in quiet, determined intervals. They didn't wander or hesitate. Abram turned and found footprints leading straight toward his family shelter.
Warfare teaches weapons. Homesteading teaches improvisation. Abram reaches the ash barrel with a plan as old as wood burning itself, using wet ash to erase sound, mask scent, and blind any man who underestimates its power. On a night when every twig snap could betray him, he turned to the quietest tool on the frontier, one that had saved more cabins than rifles ever had. The ash barrel sat behind the cabin, where heat from the earlier fires still clung faintly to its rim, warming the surrounding air just enough to stand out against the night's damp chill. The fog wrapped around it in slow coils, drifting in soft spirals that made the barrel look like a breathing thing. Abram lifted the lid carefully, letting the smell of burnt wood and steam rise in a muted wave. The ash inside was still warm from the fire he had banked after supper. The surface cracked like gray mosaic tiles. He dipped his hand in, feeling the delicate crumble slide through his fingers before scooping deeper to reach the darker, heavier material beneath. He poured a small scoop of water into the barrel, watching the dry ash thicken into a sticky slurry. When stirred, it formed a dense, almost clay-like mixture that clung to skin and fabric with surprising tenacity. Abram had learned long ago that a gallon of wet ash could coat 20 to 30 square feet of ground silently, extinguish small flames without a sound, and dull any surface it touched.
Tonight, he needed the ash for mobility. Sound could betray him faster than light, and the thief headed toward the lean-to would notice even the slightest crunch of dried needles if Abram approached without preparation. He reached into the slurry and coated his boots, working the wet ash into the creases and around the heel. The paste filled each groove in the leather, softening the friction that caused noise on dry soil and dead twigs. When the coating dried just enough to form a matte layer, he stepped lightly and heard nothing. No rustle, no scrape, only the faint shift of weight against the ground. The ash deadened each movement the way heavy snow muffles a field. It was a bushcraft trick old homesteaders passed down quietly, a skill rarely written but always remembered. Next, Abram scooped a handful of ash and smeared it across the area where he expected to step. A thin layer spread over a patch of twigs and leaf litter, turning the natural crunch beneath into a soft, muted press. He had used the technique once when guiding a neighbor through thick brush during a dry spell, and the memory came back easily. The forest respected silence, and ash helped him earn that silence. After preparing the ground, he filled a small tin cup with 3 tight handfuls of the mixture. The cup would sit at his belt, ready for emergencies when visibility needed to be interrupted or someone needed to be disoriented without noise. He reminded himself of the safety rule that came with all ash work. Avoid inhaling the dust. Even wet ash could create irritation if disturbed too suddenly. Abram kept his breathing steady, turning his head slightly away each time he dipped into the slurry. The air around the barrel felt thick, warmed by the lingering heat of the earlier fire, contrasting sharply with the cold dampness pooling near the ground. Every sensation fed into his understanding of the night's conditions, telling him how the fog would react if he threw the ash, or how quickly the scent would dissipate when carried by a light breeze. With his boots prepared and the cup of ash secured, Abram moved. The moment he stepped away from the barrel, he felt the difference. His footsteps vanished into the fog, nearly indistinguishable even to his own ears. He kept to the darker edges where the cabin's silhouette merged with the surrounding timber, letting the soft glow from his lantern reflect only on surfaces he intended. The ash along his boots dulled the friction on the ground, granting him a ghost-like gait that helped him close the distance to the lean-to without disturbing the natural rhythm of the night. The fog thickened behind the cabin, stretching in dense sheets that pressed against the cedar walls. Abram listened for the thief again, focusing on the faintest pattern of movement. The earlier footsteps had been cautious, purposeful, following a path toward the shelter where his family slept. Now he heard a moo sound, a slight shift, muffled but deliberate, as the thief adjusted his route in response to the lantern's distant glow. Abram used the river's soft lapping as cover for his repositioning, stepping when the current broke against stones or when branches overhead dropped moisture onto the ground. Each movement became a calculation, controlled and quiet.
Storyteller or narrator. As he moved closer, Abram noticed how the ash changed the visual cues around him. His own footprints, normally reflective under lantern light because of moisture, now appeared flat and dark. Ash blackened the surface and absorbed the small sheen that would have betrayed his passage. Against the fog, this lack of shine made his movements even harder to track. Anyone watching would see nothing more than a shifting blur at the edge of their perception. This advantage mattered greatly now, because the thief's path angled more directly toward the lean-to, narrowing the margin for error. Abram paused near a cluster of young spruces, their branches heavy with condensation. He could see the faint outline of the lean-to through a thinning stretch of fog. The shelter looked still, its cedar planks darkened by night moisture, its entrance slightly open where his wife had left it for airflow. The quiet inside steadied him. He needed to intercept the thief before he came too close, but without alerting the others who still moved somewhere near the riverbank. He lowered himself, bracing one hand on the ground as he leaned forward. The ash-coated soil felt cool under his touch. In that moment, the fog parted just enough to reveal a shape near the lean-to. A silhouette stood in the space where only trees should be, still and watchful, as though evaluating the shelter's entrance. But what tightened Abram's breath was not the figure's position, it was the second, smaller shape shifting behind it, indistinct but undeniably moving. A silhouette appears near the lean-to, and it isn't alone. Night combat on the frontier wasn't about strength, it was about nerve. As shadows lunge and retreat across Abram's homestead, he must stay calmer than the men hunting him and trust his ash, lantern, and instincts more than their knives. In a world where silence held more power than steel, the next few breaths would determine whether his family remained undisturbed in their sleep. The fog thickened until it felt like cloth pulled across the entire homestead, turning trees, barrels, and fence posts into wavering shapes that swelled and retreated as if alive. Light from the porch lantern dimmed into a soft amber pulse, losing its crisp edges and dissolving into the white haze. Every shape shifted, every shadow curled and unfurled like something making decisions. The yard had become a phantom field, the kind where fear thrived unless tightly leashed. Abram forced himself to breathe evenly. The ash coating on his boots had dried into a matte gray layer, allowing him to move through the fog without the slightest crunch beneath his steps. Each foot placement became a controlled glide, testing the ground, accepting only what would not betray him. Ahead, the silhouette near the lean-to drifted slightly left, as if trying to locate an angle on the shelter's entrance. Behind that shape, the second, smaller silhouette flickered in and out of view, its outline too faint to read fully, making the situation feel even more precarious. He positioned himself at a diagonal to the lean-to, careful to avoid lining his silhouette with the shelter's form. Sideways movement prevented his outline from becoming an easy target, especially for thieves relying on instinct rather than clear vision. He moved slowly, shifting weight from heel to toe while keeping knees bent to absorb noise. The distance closed steadily. 12 yards separated the thief from the lean-to. He cut that distance to 8, with deliberate patience. Timing mattered. He listened for the subtle rush of a wind gust moving through the treetops. When it came, soft, pushing fog in a gentle sideways sway, he took 2 steps, synchronizing motion with the natural rhythm of leaves brushing each other. The night accepted his movement without resistance. The fog concealed the shift in his outline completely. He eased his hand toward the tin cup at his belt, where the wet ash waited. This would be his primary tool, not the rifle resting inside the cabin or the knife sheathed against his boot. Wet ash, when thrown properly, could distort a thief's depth perception for valuable seconds. He needed only those seconds, not for confrontation, but for positioning. The goal was confusion, not harm. He paused and inhaled once, marking the thickness of the air. The wind exhaled again, carrying the faint scent of wet wood and river silt. He tilted the cup, preparing for a short, controlled throw. The trick required a practiced hand, enough ash to create a brief curtain, but not enough to make noise when leaving the cup. He flicked the mixture forward in a crisp but silent arc. The ash dispersed into the fog like muted smoke, settling across the thief's vision of field with a soft, drifting haze. The reaction was immediate but quiet. The thief flinched, stepping backward instinctively to regain balance. The slight stumble caused his boot to pull free from the mud with a suction sound, subtle but revealing. Abram recognized the shift as an opportunity. The distraction forced the thief to face away from the lean-to, trying to read the fog for threats that appeared larger than they were. In that moment, Abram moved closer and retrieved the knife the thief had dropped earlier near the cattails, not to use as a weapon, but to prevent the man from reclaiming it. Quiet neutralization, not aggression, was Abram's way.
Up on the riverside of the clearing, the other thieves reacted. The shift in their partner's posture, the barely audible grunt of surprise, and the unexpected movement of the fog alerted them. Branches snapped lightly as they adjusted their positions, recalibrating their angles. Abram could hear the faint grind of a boot heel twisting into soil as one thief stopped abruptly, sensing that something about the situation had changed. Their approach was no longer coordinated. The uncertainty in their silence told Abram their confidence had fractured. He moved again, but with even more caution. The ash on the ground created patches that looked darker than the surrounding soil, and he avoided stepping directly on them. Wet ash formed slick surfaces, and losing footing on such ground in dense fog could create noise loud enough to undo everything he had built through patience. The safety rule held firm. Never engage or maneuver on ash-slick terrain, especially when the ground sloped slightly toward the river. He circled instead, using drier patches of grass and packed soil to navigate around the lean-to's rear corner. The thief nearest to shelter shifted his stance once more, trying to shake off the confusion created by the ash curtain. Abram crouched low and took advantage of the moment, stepping into a cluster of shadow cast by the lean-to's roofline. There he settled, blending into a pocket of stillness where the fog pooled and muffled outlines into softer shapes. From this position, he could hear everything more clearly: the soft, halted breathing of the nearest thief, the cautious repositioning of the two near the river, the faint click of moisture dropping from the lean-to roof onto a patch of leaves. Abram listened for the next cue. The river, usually steady, paused in its own rhythm, as if waiting. Then a distant splash echoed from downstream, hinting that one of the thieves had repositioned, perhaps thinking the homesteader was fleeing along the waterline. The misdirection had worked better than Abram hoped. That splash carried strategic advantage. With one man now farther from the cabin, the pressure around the lean-to shifted. Abram used the opening to move silently closer, keeping his outline angled away from the lantern glow still flickering on the porch. The thief who had earlier sensed Abram's presence froze suddenly, scanning the fog with exaggerated caution. Something in the night told him the balance had shifted dramatically. Abram could almost feel the man's uncertainty through the fog's thickness. The clearing settled into a tense quiet. Every breath, every shift of moisture-heavy air carried meaning. And then, without warning, the darkness brightened. A second lantern, one Abram didn't light, flares on the riverbank. Lanterns became weapons the moment darkness swallowed the frontier. As a new light flares across the riverbank, Abram realizes the thieves intend to blind him, turning his own tactic against him. The fog around his homestead becomes an arena where beams collide, bend, and deceive, each glow a silent contest for control. The riverbank erupted with sudden amber. The new lantern's flame cut a sharp cone through the fog, as if carving a path directly towards Abram's clearing. Its brightness expanded quickly, overwhelming the softer light from Abram's own lantern and casting long, distorted shadows across the wet soil. Fog absorbed the glow and re-released it in uneven pulses, making the entire yard flicker with a strange rhythmic shimmer. Cattails along the bank glowed like half-lit spears. The stolen boots of the thieves glinted faintly in the shifting light, but their faces remained swallowed by haze. Abram felt the fog brightened against his skin, a familiar sensation from his scouting days. Glare, radiating wide, threatening to erase his night vision completely.
He knew instantly what the thieves were attempting. A bright lantern, held at chest height and directed toward the opponent, created a glare radius of roughly 20 yards. Anyone staring toward the source would be effectively blind, unable to read movement, shapes, or distance. In those moments of blindness, an opponent could advance, circle, or retreat undetected. The thieves had learned enough frontier tricks to weaponize light, and they hoped to turn that glow into a blinding wall Abram could not see through. Abram crouched low, letting the bright beam sweep overhead. The ash on his boots muted his movement as he angled sideways toward a cluster of young spruce trees. The brighter flame distorted everything it touched, washing the fog into a swirling halo that shifted unpredictably. Key lesson from scouting days echoed through his mind. Never meet an opposing lantern head-on. Doing so ruined the eye's ability to read darkness for several critical minutes. Tonight, those minutes mattered too much to risk. Every fiber of instinct told him to avoid the direct beam. He slid behind one of the spruce trunks and lowered his own lantern to knee height. The change in elevation altered the way its glow spread. Instead of projecting outward in a wide cone, the lower position directed most of the light along the ground, creating a thin, manageable line that illuminated only what he needed. The thief's lantern still overwhelmed the field in front of the cabin, but now Abram's beam competed less aggressively with the glare. The fog soaked up the lower light differently, creating a shallow, shimmering layer near the soil rather than a large, floating aura. He then angled his lantern so the beam glided behind tree trunks rather than directly into open space. Each trunk acted as a shield, catching the light and breaking it into narrow segments. This turned the lantern into a subtle painter of silhouettes instead of a beacon. It gave Abram a chance to see shifting shadows of the thieves while hiding his own outline. The method, learned by watching older scouts manipulate torchlight, was simple but effective. Redirect light along solid shapes, not through empty air. Realizing he needed to dim the lantern further, Abram dipped his fingers into the ash at his belt and smeared a thin streak across part of the lantern's glass. The ash created a muted layer, cutting brightness without extinguishing the flame. It turned the glow into a softer, diffused pulse that remained useful for reading the ground, but less likely to reveal his position. Night visibility returned gradually as the bright flare from the thieves' lantern faded from the edges of his vision. He kept his gaze slightly averted, resisting the temptation to look straight toward the opposing glow. His eyes adjusted slowly, letting the fog's layered brightness settle into manageable tones. From behind the spruce trunks, the bright lantern flared again as the thieves shifted position, swinging the glow in wide arcs. The thieves were attempting to push him into retreat by forcing glare directly into the clearing. But Abram didn't retreat. He simply moved laterally, using the spruce trunks as mirrors to read movement without exposing his silhouette. He studied the lantern's rhythm. The flare traveled left, paused, then dipped downward as one thief knelt near the river's edge. The pattern suggested coordination between the river-positioned thief and the one still near the path leading toward the cabin. The second thief, the one who had circled toward the lean-to earlier, was harder to track. Abram sensed him, but could not yet see him clearly in the fog's shifting glow.
The bright lantern's cone wavered again, this time narrower, as though the thief attempted to angle it around the clearing to catch Abram's position. Every few seconds, the fog swirled and reshaped the beam into a spiraling halo that blurred into a wide glow. The night began to flicker between illumination and shadow, neither fully one nor the other. Even the trees seemed to pulse in and out of visibility. Abram knew he needed to move before the thieves synchronized their lantern sweeps. He waited for a gust of wind, felt it tug gently at his coat, and used that moment to slip between two spruce trees. His footing remained careful, avoiding the slick ash patches near the lean-to and sticking to the drier ground where pine needles muffled any noise. Each step brought him closer to a flanking angle. His goal was not confrontation, but positioning. He needed a vantage where he could monitor all three thieves without being seen. The glare from the thieves' lantern made distance judgment tricky. Their sweep tightened, forming overlapping amber cones that shifted like overlapping stages in a poorly built theater set. Abram counted footsteps by sound rather than sight. One thief was within 30 yards, another much closer, likely near the path that curved behind the cabin. The third remained somewhere near the riverbank, the one holding the bright lantern. Abram positioned himself behind a fallen spruce trunk, the bark damp under his palm. The fog pulsed again, thickening, until both lantern glows became swirling halos suspended in the air. The two competing lights, one dim and one bright, mingled into a hazy whirlpool of gold and white. For a moment, even the thieves seemed disoriented as their silhouettes wavered between clear form and shifting blur. Then the night changed abruptly. The brighter lantern's glow faltered. It jerked downward, beam dipping toward the ground. Abram held his breath. The thief holding it took one step sideways, trying to catch balance. The glare expanded wildly, then vanished. 3 armed river thieves against one homesteader should have been a losing fight. But Abram Holt wasn't fighting with force. He was fighting with physics, shadow, ash, and grit. Tonight, intelligence became his sharpest weapon. Every choice he made carved advantage from uncertainty, turning the fog itself into a silent ally. The fog thinned just enough for shifting silhouettes to appear as faint dark smudges moving across the land. The brightest lantern had fallen moments before, its sudden extinction transforming the clearing into an unstable blend of half-light and drifting gray. Without that dominating glare, the night regained its natural gradients, soft, blurred edges where movement was detectable, but imprecise. That uncertainty favored the one who understood it best. Abram settled deeper into the cover of fallen spruce limbs, watching how the fog pulled and stretched around each shape. Distance, direction, even posture, all became readable if observed patiently. He listened. A thief's shuffle against damp earth told him one stood less than 20 yards away, close enough that the soft suction of mud around his boots reached Abram's ears. Another thief paced near the riverbank, his steps uneven, betraying hesitation after the lantern had dropped. The third thief, the one who had earlier circled near the lean-to, moved without the confidence of a hunter.
His steps curled back on themselves as though uncertainty had finally cracked through whatever plan they had rehearsed. Abram mapped each sound carefully, letting subtle cues reveal the thieves' remaining positions more clearly than sight could.
He knew the final stretch required discipline. Panic could ruin everything. The fog's thinning meant silhouettes would soon sharpen, and any misstep might turn concealment into exposure. Abram eased his lantern lower, adjusting the angle so the light brushed across the ground in thin strokes. The low beam did not betray his outline, but instead cast a sweeping, angled glow that made shadows bend in misleading directions. The thieves were already struggling to read distance. He intended to confuse them further. He prepared a strategy, a silent neutralization approach, designed to manipulate perception rather than confront directly. Step 1. Time every movement with wind gusts and rustling branches. The fog moved in lazy, predictable pulses when the wind shifted. When branches overhead brushed each other with a faint tremble, Abram moved one step, blending his motion into the natural soundscape. Step 2. Use ash to disrupt depth perception. A controlled ash throw into the fog could create a brief floating curtain that made shadows appear doubled or displaced. Step 3. Pressure the lantern's glow into the right angle to distort silhouettes. Light could push shadows sideways or stretch them across the clearing, coaxing thieves to chase images that led nowhere. Step 4. Engraved in his mind after years in the field, never engage from downhill. Lifted light angles upward along slopes, exposing a defender's outline instantly. Abram remained on even ground, protecting every angle with terrain. He moved to intercept the thief nearest the lean-to first. The man had recovered from the initial confusion, but remained unaware of Abram's new position. Abram reached the edge of a spruce cluster, crouched low, and lightly flicked a small handful of ash into the wind. The breeze carried it across the thief's path like pale dust rising from the earth. Through the fog, the ash created doubled shadows, one drifting slightly behind the other. The thief misread the shapes and pivoted sharply, facing away from Abram, convinced an attacker approached from the left. The second thief reacted to his partner's sudden turn, mistaking the motion for a sign of danger. His footsteps scuffed loudly, breaking the fragile rhythm he and the others had maintained. Abram used the noise to shift closer to the lean-to, where the fog thickened. He angled the lantern upward against the spruce trunk. This cast a long shadow that appeared to sprint across the clearing toward the river. The thieves froze, staring at the fast-moving silhouette, believing the homesteader had darted between the trees. In that confusion, Abram moved in silence. The ash on his boots muted every step. The fog shielded the outline of his body. The thieves' attention splintered in multiple directions as they attempted to track shifting shadows that no longer matched the physical world. Years of understanding shadow angles gave Abram mastery of this moment. He controlled which shadows stretched, which shrank, and which remained still. The thief nearest the lean-to stepped backward to reassess his surroundings. Abram slid behind him using the fog and ash as a cloak. Quietly, he reached forward and removed the knife that the man had sheathed at his belt, not to use it, but to rob the thief of confidence. The thief stiffened, sensing movement too close to comprehend, but Abram stepped away before the man could locate him. It was enough to unsettle the intruder completely. Meanwhile, the other two thieves panicked. The false shadows Abram had projected sent them spiraling into miscalculations, misidentifying every movement they glimpsed through the fog. One shouted a quiet warning to the other, but their understanding of the terrain had fractured. Abram kept to the edges, repeatedly slipping out of their lines of sight, using each shift in lantern glow to reposition. He ensured they saw flashes of movement only where he wanted them to look. The river thief, now without his lantern, moved hurriedly along the bank, trying to determine whether Abram had fled toward the water. Abram angled his lantern so its beam stretched across the river's surface, creating an elongated silhouette that looked like someone crouching low at the shoreline. The thief rushed toward it, mistaking the reflection for a real figure. That misjudgment pulled him farther from the clearing, granting Abram the opportunity to guide the remaining two thieves into positions where their own confusion worked against them. The second thief tripped over a root, startled by a shadow that rushed past him.
Abram intensified the misdirection, sweeping the lantern across a tree trunk to create another warped silhouette. The thief lunged at the false image, stumbling into the same patch of slick earth he had avoided earlier. His partner rushed to steady him, and their combined missteps left both exposed to nothing but the fog and their own panic. Abram stepped out just enough to let his dim lantern cast a long, angled shadow across the ground. The thieves turned toward it, hesitating. In that pause, Abram used the moment to step between the spruces. With the thieves now completely spun in their perceptions, the danger dissolved. No confrontation, no raised voice, only confusion and silence, until they retreated. The fog finally loosened its hold. A gray streak formed over the river, dawn approaching, slow and deliberate. Shapes sharpened. The clearing returned to its natural stillness. Abram steadied his breath, relieved that the night's tension was releasing its grip. And then, just as quiet returned to the land, something broke it. A splash. Small, abrupt, unmistakable, echoed across the thinning fog. Someone was still out there.
By dawn, the fog lifted, revealing what night had hidden. The river was calm, the homestead still standing, and Abram Holt remained unbroken. But the light also revealed the real story, how one man defeated 3 thieves without firing a single shot. In the quiet wash of morning, truth finally settled over the land like a long-delayed verdict. The first thin beams of sunlight drifted across the river, catching the water at an angle that turned the surface into a slow-moving sheet of gold. Where the fog had choked the world only hours earlier, clear air now stretched from bank to bank. Humidity dropped toward 60%. The change sudden enough that Abram felt the air lighten on his lungs. He stepped from the cabin porch into a yard that seemed eerily still, each detail sharpened by daylight: the damp grass, the dark soil, the glint of scattered twigs that had been invisible in the night. Even the trees looked different, their branches no longer twisted by drifting vapor, but simply reaching toward the brightening sky. A broken skiff drifted in the shallows, its stern cracked where it had struck a submerged branch. The boat rocked slowly, bumping rhythmically against the bank, proof that the thieves' retreat had been rushed and uneven. Abram watched it for a moment, studying how the current nudged it southward before the hull caught on a cluster of reeds. He stepped closer, scanning for signs of movement, but the skiff held nothing more than scattered gear, an empty sack, a torn glove, and a coil of rope that had unspooled across the bench. He walked the length of the clearing with deliberate care, reading the ground the way he had read it during the night. Mud prints that had been sharp hours earlier now softened at the edges, their forms blurring as sunlight warmed the soil. Every track pointed outward, not inward. The thieves had fled in confusion, misled by shadows, sound, and the lantern tactics he had used to fracture their movements. The night's last splash still lingered in Abram's memory, but nothing on the ground suggested anyone remained nearby. Even birds, silent through the long hours of darkness, now stirred along the treetops, returning to their usual morning rhythm. He turned back toward the cabin. The door hung slightly ajar where pressure from a thief's shoulder had tested its strength, but the hinges still held. He inspected the frame, running his hand along the wood, feeling where moisture had gathered. The damage was minimal, a small split along the lower board, something he could repair before midday. He checked the lean-to next, brushing wet cedar needles from the roof and scanning the ground for any signs of intrusion. His family still slept inside, unaware of how close danger had come. The silence inside reassured him, grounding him in the calm he had fought so hard to preserve. He moved to the small pen where his livestock rested. The animals shifted uneasily as he approached, but settled when his boots quieted on the ash-darkened ground. A feed bucket had been overturned, likely by a thief attempting to draw attention during the night, but none of the animals were harmed. Abram righted the bucket and cleaned the scattered grain, recognizing how fragile the line had been between control and chaos. Survival on the frontier was always measured in margins, and last night those margins had thinned to threads. He gathered the gear left scattered in the clearing. His tin cup, streaked with ash, lay near the edge of the spruce cluster. A handful of twigs coated with gray slurry marked where he had smeared silent pathways. He collected each piece slowly, piecing together the route he had taken and the ways the thieves had misread the landscape.
The night's movements replayed in his mind, not in flashes of fear, but as a sequence of practiced decisions, a system working exactly as intended. As the sun rose higher, Abram paused at the center of the clearing. The land around him no longer hid anything. The fog that had cloaked danger for nearly 7 hours was gone, leaving behind a clarity that felt both foreign and relieving. In that clarity came understanding, a distilled sense of what the night had proven. Light is a tool, not a comfort. Wet ash silences more than footsteps. Fog turns rivers into battlegrounds. Never reveal your silhouette first. Sound is a map at night. Deception beats force in darkness. These principles settled over Abram with the ease of long-earned truth. They were not rules written by men, but carved by the land itself, shaped by experience, hardship, and necessity. The frontier respected those who listened to its lessons and punished those who ignored them. Last night, Abram had chosen to listen. He walked toward the riverbank, lantern held low so the morning light glinted softly off the ash still clinging to his boots. The world looked open again, no longer bound by fog. The river moved with calm intention, carrying broken reeds and the drifting skiff along its steady path. Abram watched the current, knowing that it had been both adversary and ally. It had masked sounds, carried silhouettes, and distorted light in ways the thieves had not expected. The river had told the truth only in the morning, revealing how it had shaped every moment. He stepped to the edge of the bank, feeling the quiet settle around him. The night was over. The land was steadied. His family remained safe. But the frontier seldom allowed long rests, and the river, calm as it seemed, held its own warnings in the shifting morning current. Far downriver, a new skiff drifted into view, unmarked, and heading his way. In one night, Abram Holt proved the frontier didn't belong to the strongest men, but to the smartest. No bullets, no brawls, just lantern light, river physics, and the courage to stay calm when the dark closed in. Stories like this remind us how thin the line was between danger and survival on America's edge. And somewhere downriver, the next threat is already drifting in.